All right, well, first of all, thank you all. My name is Kristina Medero, and my topic is a content analysis of voluntourism advertisement. So, voluntourism or volunteer tourism is a new cultural phenomenon in which Western organizations advertise the Global South as a place to come and volunteer. This is separate from your study abroad programs, and they're going to be focused more as third-party organizations that advertise to students about our age. And so we're going to go over a basic definition of what volunteer tourism or voluntourism is exactly, the hypothesis and research questions that guided this study, the variables I used to test for the content analysis, as well as the theoretical expectations I had, and finally the results and what actually happened. So, as I said, many commercial and charitable organizations have begun advertising the Global South as an opportunity to volunteer. This is called voluntourism, and while many social outlets have kind of pointed out some negative impacts of this, paternalism, colonialism, as well as othering of other cultures, when it comes to more academic studies, in communication studies, there have been advertisement content analysis of charities, but then for volunteer tourism, just more qualitative work to see how volunteers experience once they are abroad. However, nothing so far besides this research has kind of conjoined those two ideas. How are they advertising to the volunteers or potential volunteers in the first place? One of the books, Blackman and Benson in 2010, was one of the social outlets that really started to identify some of the problematic nature with volunteer tourism, highlighted some of the things that volunteers tend to boast about. And these are called expectations of exchange. Basically, by buying into these experiences, the volunteers have an expectations of what they're buying from the organization. And that is a novel experience, adventure, and identity. And within each of these topics, there is a subtopic. Maintenance being that there is a maintained relationship with the culture, and that maintained relationship is long-term. So even after the experience, the volunteer feels a connection to that culture. And of course, this idea of adventure, that they're interacting with something new, with the locals, with food, music, language. They're creating something that's new to them. And then ultimately why they're going there, the output, whether that's teaching students, providing medicines, or painting a wall and helping with more structural issues in the country. Their work has a significant output for them. And then ultimately, identity. Many of the volunteers go because they want to develop a sense of self, and there's this emotional connection to the work that they're doing. Within charities, when you're trying to basically get people to either volunteer their time or money, there's different images that these organizations use. So they will use egoism when they're trying to capture people to just donate money. Egoism is this thought of, you're doing so great, look how much your money is going to do. These images are going to be represented by sickly children, seeing like how much your money is needed. And then altruistic appeals, these images are going to be more of the output image. Look how happy these children are now that you've volunteered. So based on these different variables, I created a theoretical expectation based on this idea of cultural intelligence. If these volunteer tourism organizations want to produce the global citizens that they suggest they are creating, then they should be giving or advertising that the volunteers are going to create an idea of knowledge. So what is the culture? Motivation, so that they should be advertising that the volunteer will want to change their behaviors to fit more in line with the culture. And also ultimately the behavior, that the volunteer will perform the accurate behaviors in order to interact with that culture. And so based on that theoretical expectation, I created several hypotheses and an overall research question. First hypothesis is that volunteer tourism organizations that require donations of time will rhetorically ask for expectations of exchange that promote the novel, adventurous, and identity-developing experience. Second, volunteer tourism organizations will market more images of altruistic appeals to entice a stronger donation of time. Volunteer organizations will market egotistic appeals to entice monetary donations. And finally, volunteer tourism organizations that require a time investment will portray images of diverse volunteers, staff, and leaders. Within the charity research, they suggest that when they promote diversity amongst the people who are helping, it creates a stronger connection to that charity and thus a long-term relationship. But overall, was just trying to figure out what marketing techniques do these volunteer tourism organizations use to advertise to potential volunteers. And so I had two coders in order to go through different websites. I had a culmination of 15 total websites. I trained the second coder using a separate website that was not used in the sample. And we used a kappa coefficient in order to figure out that intercoder reliability, which, as you can see, is 0.656, which is relatively close to 1, which is what you're really shooting for. A perfect 1 would mean that when we coded for the exact same thing. So there was some variance, but overall intercoder reliability was reliable. And this is how the data sheet looked when I was going over and training the other coder. Basically, each expectation earned a point, yes or no. If that subtopic was not represented, it did not earn a point. The total points were calculated, and then a one sample t-test was used in order to see the differences between organizations that required monetary donations and organizations that asked for more time donation. And overall, there was only one significant hypothesis. Volunteer tourism organizations that require donations of time rhetorically did use those expectations of exchange to get volunteers to volunteer, which suggests that because they want to promote that idea of novelty, adventure, and identity development, that's what they're rhetorically really pushing for. However, there was no difference between volunteer organizations that wanted time donation versus monetary donation and the images they used on those websites. They varied, so there was no significance there. Similarly, volunteer tourism organizations that required the time donation didn't really show diversity either. So even if they are using a variety of these strategies, what's important to note is that those volunteer tourism organizations are definitely pushing, rhetorically at least, those expectations of exchange. When it comes to the question, this is how we were looking at the volunteer tourism websites. There were some limitations to the overall study. First of all, even if this is what those organizations are advertising, it doesn't really state what the volunteers are experiencing and what the effects of those advertisements are. Do they choose to volunteer because of the advertisement strategy, or is there subconscious pull that we need to study abroad to show that we're credible and successful humans and be successful in our careers? Is that the driving factor? Overall, there needs to be a better definition of exactly what volunteer tourism is, and future research should continue to look at that definition, as well as look at the diversity of the volunteers actually making the trip abroad. Research suggests that right now about 80% of volunteer tourists are white Westerners, and how would increasing that diversity change the impact of what those organizations are claiming to accomplish? So overall, this study quantitatively added to the field of communication by analyzing the rhetorical and the images on websites of volunteer tourism organizations. Overall, if we are encouraging our students to study abroad and volunteer abroad, we should be thinking critically about what that impact might be making for the cultures we're interacting with. So thank you all for listening. Are there any questions?
It's time to come to the close. Have any questions?